Today's lesson is going to focus on the Native American struggle to maintain their way of life as white settlers push into the Western territories. In the centuries leading up to the mid-1800s, the Great Plains were home to millions of buffalo as well as many Native American nations where they lived side by side. The Native Americans of the Great Plains depended on the buffalo for many of their resources, and as a result of that, many lived a nomadic life. And nomadic simply means that you're not really going to settle in one place forever. You're going to move from place to place in search of that resource. In this case, obviously, it was the buffalo. And the struggle really begins when the buffalo populations sharply decrease as a result of railroad companies bringing in hunters to actually get rid of the buffalo. They kind of saw them as a nuisance and getting in the way of the railroad. So hunters were brought in, they killed them by the thousands, and this was then depleting a resource that the Native Americans really depended on. Now, as white settlers moved west, the government made treaty after treaty agreeing to put Native American tribes on what are known as reservations. And a reservation is a tract of land set aside for Native Americans that we would promise never to take away from them. And usually, years down the road, we would find some reason to need that land and go back on our word. Now, our U.S. Army was given the authority to deal with the groups of Native Americans who would not move onto these reservations. Now, the reservations were usually located on poor land, and as a result of that, supplies were going to be needed in order for the natives to survive on that land. And the government would promise that they would bring those supplies, they would supplement their food, and many times they actually failed to do so in the end. And so this map that I've put here for you shows the parts that are in the reddish-orange shade show the location of Indian reservations. And so those are just some of the places that were set aside, and we allowed them to live on that land without any interference. During the 1960s, we saw many armed clashes between Native Americans and white settlers. And conflict was instigated by both sides. I mentioned earlier that the government sometimes tricked natives in order to force them off their land, and they would go back on promises. On the other side, the natives would be aggressive towards the settlers, and they would attack their homes, wagons, and trains in protest. And some of the sites of the biggest clashes were in Colorado and also in Minnesota and in the Dakota Territory, which wasn't yet North and South Dakota. Speaking of the Dakotas, this becomes the site of a really controversial land issue between the Sioux Native Americans and prospectors looking to find gold. So to start out, what happens is that the government, as it always did, promised that no settlement would occur in the Black Hills region of the Dakotas. So it was a certain area in the Dakota Territory. But as this, often happened, rumors of gold were advertised in the newspaper, and this brought many prospectors to the area in hopes of striking it rich. And of course, the Sioux were not happy with this, and they threatened that there would be retaliation for encroaching on their land. One of their leaders, Sitting Bull, he refused to sell the land to the prospectors, and another really important leader, Crazy Horse, joined him. And so, of course, the U.S. Army, as they always did, was sent to go deal with this conflict and come up with a resolution. And these forces were led by Lieutenant Colonel Custer. And he's largely outnumbered when the conflict actually takes place. And in a very, very short amount of time, the conflict ends and Custer is defeated. All of his men are dead. And the Sioux and Cheyenne eventually do surrender after reinforcements are sent in, and they make their way onto a reservation. So even though they initially win the battle, known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, they do lose out in the end because they are moved off of the land in question and moved onto a reservation. Conflict also broke out in the Southwest. And this was in the 1870s, and the Apache were moved onto a reservation in Arizona, and their leader, Geronimo, he obviously was very much against this, and he fled to Mexico. just south of Arizona. And during the decade of the 1880s, he would kind of lead a small force into Arizona and lead raids on the town and terrorize the citizens. And so thousands of troops were then sent to try to find Geronimo, and it was almost like a huge manhunt and to find him and his warriors. And it was finally in 1886 that he gave up and surrendered, and he's known as being the last Native American to surrender to American forces. In reaction to all of this conflict, the Native American culture had no choice but to change. And so the factors, of course, that influenced these changes were the movement of whites onto their lands, and you also had the slaughter of the buffalo, their main resource for many of the Plains Indians. Of course, they were dealing with the U.S. Army attacks and the government's reservation policies. So these were all drastic changes to their lifestyles that they had been maintaining for a really long time, up until all of this conflict. And then in 1887, Congress passes what becomes known as the Dawes Act, and this calls for the breakup of reservations because they felt as though giving the Native American tribes big reservations kind of kept them strong and united. So they wanted to break them up and to give each family their own plot of land. They thought that would make them a little more independent and make them, more like the white settlers. They would start farming, and, after doing that, they would become American citizens. And they wanted them to no longer identify with a tribal group and say, I'm part of this tribe, again, because that gave them some sense of strength. And, the government was trying to not only physically make them weak as a group, but also to kind of weaken their spirit and try to Americanize them. And this ended up being a major failure. Very few people wanted to become American citizens, and, they remained on the reservations. And now during this time, a special ceremony called the Ghost Dance became really popular with many Western Native Americans. And the ceremony was all about hoping for the day when the settlers would disappear and the buffalo would return and everybody could go back to living the way they used to. And as this dance, this celebration spread, white officials became really nervous and they actually banned the ritual. And they believed that Sitting Bull was the leader of this movement, and the police tried to arrest him. And while they're in the process of arresting Sitting Bull, there's an accidental shot that kills him. And so after the killing of Sitting Bull, several hundred of the Sioux gather at a creek at Wounded Knee, and this is where they're kind of surrendering. They see his death as, the end to their struggle. So in December of 1890, the U.S. Army goes to collect their weapons. And, once again, there's an accidental shot that rings out, and this causes kind of a panic, and the Army opens fire on the Sioux. And when the conflict was over, there were more than 200 dead. You can see the bodies here in this picture. And this marks the end of armed conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. government. And of course, as settlers, make their homes out west, there were isolated incidents of conflict, but nothing on a large scale really involving the U.S. Army was to happen again.